welcome. We got an exciting live webinar for you today. Go further, faster, better. How to improve your endurance with InsideTracker. My name is Rowie Metzer. I'm the Director of Business Development at InsideTracker. And we've got an awesome discussion plan for you today about how to improve your endurance with blood-based insights from InsideTracker. So today we're going to hear from professional Nike trail runner and running coach Matt Daniels, sports RD and InsideTracker lead nutrition scientist Ashley Reaver, and sports RD and triathlete Stevie Smith. Our objective today is to leave you with practical steps you can take to level up your endurance this year, whether your goal is to PR, come back from, or prevent injury, or to simply ensure that you're keeping your body healthy and resilient despite the physical and mental stress of training. Before we start, I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing InsideTracker. I promise to keep this part short so we can hear from our awesome panelists. And quick reminder that this webinar will be recorded. So you'll get the link for the recorded video after the session. And then please do feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat, and we're going to do our best to address as many as we can. So let's get going. I'm going to share my screen. And let's dive into just a quick overview of InsideTracker. All right. So super brief overview, but we're going to start from the very beginning, our founder's story. So after losing a relative as a young child, our founder and chief science officer, Dr. Gil Blander, decided to devote his life to helping people live longer, better lives. After years of research as a postdoc at one of the premier aging research labs in the world, the Lenny Garante lab at MIT, Gil founded InsideTracker in 2009 to fulfill his life's mission to help humans everywhere add years to their life and life to their years. Now, InsideTracker was founded on 4 core principles. The first is ultra personalization. We're all different. In order to be truly personalized, we believe that you have to start inside. The same way that you would pop your hood open on your car so your mechanic can fix what's broken and your car runs smoothly for another few thousand miles, Gil founded InsideTracker with the philosophy that there's really no reason why we shouldn't be doing the same for our bodies, which is why the first step of doing InsideTracker is a blood analysis. It's really our version of popping the hood open on your body to get an accurate and scientifically validated picture of where you stand and your unique areas for improvement before you take action. The second core principle is that normal is not good enough. So we all want to be our best and achieve peak performance in whatever performance means to us at work, at home, in our athletic pursuits. Our philosophy is that achieving our best self requires going a step further than settling for just normal. And the classic example of how this comes to life for endurance athletes is, one particular example is ferritin. So ferritin is a measure of iron stores in your body, and the normal range for ferritin is from around 20 to 300 nanograms per milliliter in men and 12 to 150 nanograms per milliliter in women. That's a huge range, and that's the normal range. However, there's sufficient evidence to support the fact that endurance athletes have greater iron needs and therefore higher ferritin needs than the average individual, which is why InsideTracker creates an optimal range, which is more narrow than the normal range for every biomarker, and it's personalized to you. So for example, my ferritin optimal range is 60 nanograms per milliliter, or it starts at 60, and that's above the low end of the normal range of 20, but that's what's right for me as an active 31-year-old male. And InsideTracker is focused on helping me optimize my ferritin and then keep it in the optimal range. The third principle of InsideTracker is to use science to cut through all the BS out there around nutrition, performance, and recovery. And I know all of us are bombarded every day with conflicting information on these topics, and it can leave us frustrated, confused, and at worst, paralyzed. InsideTracker uses science-grade inputs like blood, along with recommendations that have been distilled from tens of thousands of peer-reviewed studies that our science team has reviewed over the last 12 years so that you don't have to, in order to cut through all of that noise and remove the guesswork. And then the fourth principle is to be holistic. So in addition to blood, InsideTracker collects DNA, data from fitness trackers, primarily looking at sleep, heart rate, and activity, data from self-reported questionnaires like your age and gender and ethnicity, height, weight, habits, and goals. And then by combining this diverse set of information, InsideTracker and the algorithm behind it is able to deliver insights and recommendations that are truly personalized. So what does InsideTracker actually do? Well, two main things. So first of all, it delivers a clear and holistic picture of exactly what's going on inside your body. And then it delivers actionable nutrition and lifestyle recommendations that are backed by peer-reviewed studies and based on a combination of all of that data. So blood, DNA, fitness tracker, and self-reported. And before we jump into the discussion, I want to mention one thing, which is that we recently announced a program called InsideTracker Pro, which was really designed to make it easy for coaches, trainers, RDs, practitioners, and their athletes to incorporate InsideTracker into their training. So if you're a coach, trainer, or RD, or if you're an athlete who works with one, I highly encourage you to check out InsideTracker Pro. It's insidetracker.com/pro to learn more about the program. And I'm especially excited to have one of the founding members of the program with us today, Matt, who's a running coach and runs Matt Daniels Run Club. So we're going to get a little more into his coaching in a little bit here. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we can dive in. So before we jump in, I want to ask two quick questions for everyone watching. First of all, what's your #1 endurance goal this year? And second question, if you've done an InsideTracker test, what biomarker are you focused on improving? Please drop your comments in the chat. All right, so let's start by introducing Matt. Hey, Matt.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So I'm gonna give Matt's background before we jump in. So Matt grew up in Arlington, Texas, and served in the US Navy and ran at Adams State University in Alamosa, Colorado. Matt is a Nike Elite trail runner. He finished 4th at the 2009 Western States 100. And crazily enough, this was his first Western States appearance and actually his first 100-mile race. He finished 1st at the Black Canyons 100K. He's a 3-time member of Team USA for the World Mountain Running Championships. He's an Olympic Marathon Trials qualifier. He is one of the select few to run a sub 4-minute mile. And perhaps even more impressive is he has the unique distinction of being the first elite athlete to run both a sub 4-minute mile and race Western States 100-mile ultra marathon. Most importantly, he is the husband to marathoner Lauren Daniels and dog dad to 2 dogs named Dash and Cadence. And I do want to quickly also introduce our 2 other panelists today, Ashley Reaver and Stevie Smith. So hi, Ashley. So Ashley is a certified sports dietitian. She's InsideTracker's lead nutrition scientist. She received her undergraduate degree in nutritional sciences and dietetics from Cornell, and her graduate degree in nutrition science and policy from Tufts. And yes, I can confirm that she is super smart. Ashley has completed numerous half marathons and 2 half Ironman races. And then Stevie Smith is the third, last but not least, panelist here. Hi, Stevie. So Stevie is a registered dietitian. She's board certified specialist in sports nutrition. She received her BS in dietetics and nutrition after completing the coordinated program in dietetics at SUNY Buffalo State. She then got her master's in science in applied nutrition with a sports and fitness concentration from Northeastern. So Stevie is super focused and has helped hundreds of athletes and active individuals fuel to improve their performance, energy, and recovery without feelings of guilt or restriction. And this is really drawing from her own experience growing up playing team sports, completing 10 full Ironman triathlons. So she knows firsthand how important nutrition is to be a healthy, happy, and strong athlete. And when she's not swimming, biking, or running, you can find her outside exploring new trails with her adorable dog, Chance. Sensing a theme here. All right, so let's start with Matt. So Matt, first question for you is, how did you get into running in the first place?
Gosh, that's a loaded question. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for joining in. It's awesome. Looks like we got quite a few people here. Yeah, I guess, I first got started running at a pretty young age at 11. Got introduced into it doing summer track from a friend of mine. And from there, it was kind of a natural progression, doing summer track, and then junior high school doing track and cross country, high school track and cross country, and then all the way up to the professional level. I never really stopped other than a short stint in the Navy. So yeah, I guess it was just by chance a friend of mine introducing summer track to me. It's kind of how I got into it.
Well, you've had a long career, that's for sure, and a dynamic running career. filled with ups and downs, injuries and victories, and I'm sure many learnings along the way. So what made you decide to actually become a running coach?
Gosh, a lot of reasons. I think I was very fortunate enough early on in my career to have many great coaches. When you run as long as I have, I've had quite a few different coaches, and throughout that time, I've been able to not only have them as my coach, but have them as mentors and people I can really, sit down and talk to and learn physiology and learn, everything there is to do about, to know about running. And I became really interested. I think probably around 13 or 14 years old into everything running. I wasn't your normal kid growing up in Texas where I was obsessed with the Dallas Cowboys. I wanted to watch old footage of, elite runners from back in the 60s and 70s. And because of that, I was introduced to a coach, Terry Jessup, in high school, and he knew Arthur Lydiard. And Arthur Lydiard is probably one of the founders of endurance training, really big name in the 60s and even before that, I guess, with many Olympians. And I had the chance to sit down with him before he passed away and learned a lot, and that kind of sparked the fire for me. And from there, I've just always had this interest, and I figured, hey, when I'm at the position in life where I can use all this knowledge and everything and coach, I'm going to give back a little bit to this sport, and here I am and enjoying every minute of it.
That's awesome. Well, I'm sure you have a lot of, obviously, from personal experience to share. So I can only imagine how great of a coach you are. So let's actually dive into InsideTracker. So let's talk about your InsideTracker story. So why did you choose to use InsideTracker in the first place?
Yeah, I got introduced to InsideTracker from my coach, David Roach. I guess this was back in probably 2017. Before going into a big training block, we thought, hey, let's get a blood panel done, get some blood work done, and make sure everything's good to go before we start diving into some ultra training, because I hadn't run an ultra up until that point. And so got a test done, and I was amazed with all the information I could get from it. Beforehand, any blood work I'd done, I got a printout from the doctor, and I didn't know what to make of it. It was just numbers and on a sliding scale, and a doctor couldn't really relate to what I was doing as an endurance athlete and couldn't give me proper information back, and it was kind of frustrating. And so when I used InsideTracker for the first time and saw the diet recommendations and like things on like how to reduce stress when I had high cortisol levels, things like that just blew my mind, and it was game changer. I mean, I think for me, a lot of the early success I had in ultra running was due to the fact that I was regularly getting blood tests done.
That's great. So I want to dive on one particular experience in a little more detail, which is the one that you had last year at Western States. So can you talk a little bit about that experience that you had going into that event? And in particular, I know that you had done an InsideTracker test right around then going into that race. So I'd love it if you could talk about what you learned during that phase and how you used that data to inform your plan going into the race.
Definitely. Yeah, like you said, but right before Western States, I think, gosh, this is probably about 2.5 months out before the race. David and I discussed, hey, we're going into a big training block, see if we can get the most out of training before your first 100. And so, before going in your first 100, one thing we discussed that was really important was let's get blood work done and make sure you're healthy. I mean, nobody needs to be running 100 miles if you're not healthy and blood levels aren't optimized. And for the first time, and I don't know how long, everything was optimized. So we got the blood work done. Everything looked great. Like, I mean, I think there's maybe a few things that needed adjustments, but nothing out of the ordinary, couldn't fix with diet or a little extra sleep or whatever. But yeah. And so because I had all my levels pretty much optimized, it was go time. Like David said, hey, let's take some risks with training and just see what can happen. And that's what we did. And I was able, it paid off. It was a big reward. I was able to have a good first 100-mile debut, and everything was solid through the whole training process with that. The blood work afterwards, that told a different story, but hey, that's what 100 miles do to you. So
yeah, I can only imagine. I don't know from personal experience, and I don't think I'll ever find out. So this actually is a good segue into one of the things that I know you talk a lot about, both as an athlete and as a coach, which is this concept of slowing down to speed up.
Mhm.
And I know that was really a mindset shift for you, where early on in your career, you were constantly pushing hard because you felt like you had to give max effort all the time. But that also led to, this injuries, chronic injury, and that this shift in mindset that you made to really slow down to speed up has helped you eliminate the majority of the injuries that you faced and experienced earlier in your career. And I really love your quote, that slowing down doesn't mean that you're becoming a slower runner. It means that you're becoming a smarter runner. And I think that probably resonates with a lot of the people that are watching today. So can you talk a little bit about what it took to make that shift and how you use objective evidence and data, like insights that are coming from InsideTracker, to decide when it makes sense to push or to back off?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, really what it took to make the change was seeing blood work and having a coach tell me like, hey, this is what's going on. This is why, these biomarkers in your blood work are, so messed up. And a lot of it's because we're not recovering. And the reason I wasn't recovering was I was running way too hard every single day on all my runs. When you get to a certain level of fitness, every run can somewhat quote unquote feel easy. You can go out, and for me, I was running, under 6-minute mile pace on every single run I was doing. And I was like, hey, I feel pretty good. I'm fit. This isn't too bad. It's pretty easy. But little did I know, like I wasn't recovering in between the runs. Another thing that was going on is I was living at altitude. So for a lot of my running career, I've been at 7,000 plus feet where I live. And that's just another variable to go into recovery. So yeah, it took me getting 7 stress fractures. I don't know how many Achilles injuries, a torn hamstring. I'm sure I had other issues with my nervous system or anything else that, was related to overtraining. But yeah, it took all that and a coach to kind of tell me, hey, like, this is what's going on. Let's back off a little bit. And yeah, and that's the problem I think a lot of people run into is, there's a difference between what feels easy and what is truly easy. And you got to think every time you go out for a run or any sort of endurance exercise, you're breaking your body down. You're not doing it any favors. And the whole point of breaking it down is when it rebuilds, you build fitness. But it's only going to rebuild if you give it the time. And I wasn't allowing that. I wasn't giving it the nutrients it needed. I wasn't sleeping enough. I wasn't running easy enough in between the hard efforts. And so, yeah, it was accumulation of a lot of things for sure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I can imagine it's something that not only you have experienced, and I can imagine it's hard when you feel great to really force yourself to slow down. And I can also imagine that, especially when you can't see the issues that are underlying, it makes it even harder to know when it's the right time to push and when it's the right time to slow down. So I think this is actually a great chance for us to bring in our superstar duo of sports RDs, Ashley and Stevie. Hi, Ashley. Hi, Stevie.
Hi.
And what I'd like to do is I'd actually like to dive a little bit deeper on that topic, but really about the specific biomarkers that are most critical for endurance athletes. So Ashley, why don't you kick us off? Which markers should endurance athletes care about and why?
So Stevie and I have a bit of a list and we're going to go back and forth to talk about it. I would say one that stands out a lot is cortisol. And that's also a marker that maybe you can get tested occasionally if there's something seriously wrong with you, but most people have never had their cortisol tested before an InsideTracker test. And cortisol, a background on what cortisol is, basically it's your fight or flight hormone. Its role in the body is to break down your muscle and convert a handful of amino acids that can be converted into glucose into that fuel source for you to use either while you are fighting whatever is attacking you or while you are running from it. And that sounds, kind of crappy, but thousands of years ago, that made a lot of sense. It was awesome that our body could do that, because if a lion jumped out at you, how awesome that your body can hopefully provide you enough fuel to get out of that situation. And most of us aren't being chased by wild animals, maybe on a trail every now and then. Some of us encounter them. But that cortisol is something that kind of shows you a softer side of training. It can be influenced by sleep, mental stress, which is obviously a big thing a lot of us are dealing with right now, but also something that I think a lot of endurance athletes fall into a type A category of a type of person that likes to add a lot of extra stress to their plate. So that is something that can show up a lot. Under fueling and also not getting enough rest and recovery is also a really big one. And I know Stevie works with this a lot too, and sees it in her athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things that I try to gently remind people, and also myself, that you can't out train a high cortisol. Like, it's just like running into a wall. If you don't allow your body, like Matt was talking about, the rest and recovery it needs, eventually you're going to see the negative outcomes of that high cortisol. Decreased bone density, decreased immunity, anxiety, depressed moods, loss of muscle tissue, right? Which is working again against everything we want to achieve as an endurance athlete. So I know I put myself, and I try to put some of my clients into a running timeout if they're just continuing to try and push through the cortisol levels. Look at ways you can increase rest, recovery, reduce stress, looking at the stress bucket, as I like to call it. You can only handle so much at one time. So if life stress is high, maybe training stress backs off, and like looking at nutrition and being like, okay, am I really being diligent about eating enough, really nutrient dense, rich, fueling foods throughout the day. So that's a super important one.
Yeah,
endurance athletes, but also
for everyone.
Any other high performer.
Yeah,
sure. And I know Matt, I think cortisol was actually one of the things that you discovered was something that you needed to focus a little bit more on. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. That was especially early on when I first started getting tests. It was always high, and so that's something I and it still is most of the time I get it tested. So that's something I'm consistently always working on because I know the effect it can have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Ashley, Stevie, what else should endurance athletes care about in terms of the biomarkers that they should be paying most attention to?
Well, I'll round that out and then pass it to Stevie. We also measure testosterone and free testosterone, as well as DHEAS for females, but in particular for testosterone versus cortisol, we also have a ratio of the two. Testosterone is an anabolic hormone. It's one that builds us up. It's one that is definitely important to make sure that your muscles are recovering as well as growing, different connections that are there too. So looking at that ratio of testosterone, which is this anabolic hormone that builds us up, to cortisol, which is a catabolic hormone, one that breaks us down, is also kind of a really easy way to see if you are primed for improvements in your endurance or gains in strength, or if the scales are kind of tilted more towards overtraining and way too much stress. And as Stevie said, you're doing so much training to try and build more muscle, to try and get faster, to try and run longer. Ignoring that stress piece of the bucket kind of just counteracts most of what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a super helpful indicator. And like, I know a lot of the male athletes I speak to are always concerned about their testosterone levels, and they try to be like, all right, do I need to do more strength training, or can I just eat a ton of protein and fix this? And it really, especially that marker, comes down to rest and recovery. Are you, giving your body enough sleep? If you're a runner, are you doing enough cross training? Not so much of the repetitive pounding, especially if you're a road runner. It's a little bit more rough on the body. So another of course, top marker, I know, Rowie, you mentioned it kind of on your intro, is ferritin levels. So this tends to be a big issue in endurance athletes, particularly female endurance athletes, really struggle with this marker. And it is, protein that contains iron, and it's the primary form of iron stored inside the cells. So it gives us a really good, accurate picture of an individual's iron status. It's really a key part of the formation of oxygen carrying proteins, hemoglobin, myoglobin. So, for endurance athletes, I mean, if you're male or female, short distance, long distance, this is key in your performance. Often, if this number is low, you're feeling fatigue a lot, you're feeling that shortness of breath. I know, having tested so many times and struggling with my ferritin, if I start to feel winded going up the stairs, I know it's time to start checking back into this. And, with all of these markers, including cortisol and the sex hormones that we spoke about that Ashley just mentioned, I personally, but also with a lot of long distance endurance athletes, you're kind of used to just kind of being at this low level tired and fatigued. So it's another thing that I see a lot of people try to continue to push through. Because you're like, well, I'm training X hours a week and running X miles, so I should feel tired. But at a point, you shouldn't be feeling tired at every single workout. Like, you shouldn't be struggling through every single run, every single bike. So this is an important one to pay attention to. This number will also fall before hemoglobin levels fall, which, if you're familiar with the blood work that you get with your doctor, they will always check hemoglobin. But ferritin is definitely a little bit more of a challenge to get them to test. You have to have a good relationship or like a pretty firm stance. But probably, I'm going to say, unless you're a menstruating female, it's going to be very hard for you to get this measured from your doctor. So it's kind of like one of the most key things for endurance athletes, for sure.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that a little bit, iron deficiency is the number one micronutrient deficiency in the United States, largely led by premenopausal females. The risk of iron deficiency is higher if you're a vegan or vegetarian or don't eat red meat often. No, red meat's not the only source, but in the US, it is the primary source of iron for most people. And then if you do endurance, a lot of endurance sports on top of it, hitting the ground with your foot while you're running can, damage some of those red blood cells that are passing on your foot at that point, increasing your need for more iron to replace them. There's a lot of friction that happens in your body while you're doing endurance events that can also do that. So the risk of being iron deficient and it not showing up on a regular test from your doctor until you are really, really deficient, till you have anemia, which is when it would show in your hemoglobin, for active premenopausal females is pretty high. And it's a bummer that ferritin is not a marker that is included, because it's the best marker that you can really use for your iron metabolism. Another one that I'll say too is vitamin D.
So Ashley,
Yep.
Ashley, just before we dive into vitamin D, we had a question that I think maybe a few people might be interested in hearing the answer to, which is, Bob is asking what plant sources are highest for ferritin bioavailability or digestibility. And he's asking if it requires a combination of foods. He was told to have OJ with his oatmeal to make iron more available, but doesn't know if this is bro science or truth. So can you hit on that?
Yeah. So there's two forms of iron. You have heme iron, which is what you would get from animal sources, same type of hemoglobin that's in your blood. The other type is non-heme iron. And non-heme iron is what you get from plant sources. And plant sources are a little bit more difficult to absorb for two reasons. One, your body prefers heme iron. It can go through the process of converting this non-heme iron or the iron from plants into the form of heme iron, but it does have to go through that conversion before your body can absorb it. So now you're kind of adding one step if you're getting iron plants, your body has to convert it into this form of iron that you get from animals before it can be absorbed. The other thing that can reduce the bioavailability of iron from plant sources is that plants have a lot of other nutrients in them that can bind to that iron. In particular, there's 3 big quote unquote anti-nutrients, which are present in a lot of plant foods. So phytic acid is one that's in a really high amount in beans in particular, which is often touted as a great source of iron. A lot of that iron that you would consume with beans kind of gets caught up in that. Certainly if you're soaking beans, if you're overcooking beans pretty dramatically, you can reduce the impact of that. Iron, I know growing up, I watched, I should say my parents made me watch Popeye quite a bit, like eating iron or eating spinach to get a lot of iron. Spinach is really high in another one of these anti-nutrients called oxalic acid. Same thing. You can eat a lot of spinach and hopefully it would get you to your iron needs, but unfortunately your body's just not going to be able to absorb all of that. And then the third one would be polyphenols, which chocolate is also a pretty good source of iron, but it's also very high in these polyphenols. So it is possible, but it is difficult to depend just on plant sources for meeting your iron needs. In particular, again, if you're a premenopausal female where your iron needs are over 3 times that of what men are. To your orange juice point, it can be helpful because that conversion from non-heme iron to heme iron, some vitamin C is needed in that process. So that's where orange juice can be helpful. But squeezing lemon juice over like any type of plant-based meal that you have would be just the same. Oatmeal doesn't have a ton of iron in it. So more so chug your orange juice with something else that's higher in that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so you wanted to hit on vitamin D next, and I think that's one that people have probably heard about. So
yeah, I feel like vitamin D now is getting all sorts of buzz for its impacts on immunity. Certainly with COVID, it's gotten a lot of press recently, which is certainly important for endurance athletes. It's also considered to be something that can help with muscle recovery. But I often think that vitamin D's like main purpose is often lost in all of these other conversations about it. Why vitamin D is an essential nutrient is because we need vitamin D to be able to absorb calcium from our digestive tract. And for endurance athletes, in particular runners that are doing a lot of high impact activity, a lot of pounding, if you have lower levels of vitamin D and therefore are absorbing less of that calcium from your digestive tract, what happens is that your blood basically takes it out of your bones. Your blood requires a certain level of calcium. That's because calcium is important in your body for so much more than just your bones. You literally need it to trigger every muscle contraction, which includes your heart beating. So your blood is super, super protective over how much calcium is there all the time. And if your vitamin D is low and you're not getting enough calcium from your diet, or you're choosing to not include foods that are high in calcium, that is something that drastically increases your risk of weakening your bones. Plus all of that pounding is going to increase your risk of stress fractures. In addition to just not eating enough food and maybe also having really high levels of stress. They all kind of tied together, but vitamin D is certainly an important one. And I do think that it's one that a lot of people are surprised if their marker is low, especially if they live in Southern California or Florida. But if you go outside with sunblock on, sleeves, a hat, you're pretty much cutting off your opportunity to produce vitamin D in your skin from the sun. So, and people that are up north, it's more difficult. If you have darker skin, if you have more melanin in your skin, it's more difficult. As you age, it's more difficult. So there is a high amount of people that have lower levels of vitamin D.
Yeah, Ashley, you
long-winded, sorry.
You got it all on that one. I mean, you can see I'm in the Northeast, it's getting dark, so I'm turning my light on so I'm not in the shadows anymore, but it's definitely, I'm located in Buffalo, so you know, and also this is if you're, you know, seeing your doctor, it's easier to get this checked, so it's good to have kind of a lot more of those data points for this one, because, you know, just as an example, I know that okay, November 1st, I start my vitamin D supplement. June 1st, I stop it. And I can look at the trend from all of my InsideTracker tests that keeps my vitamin D, right in the middle of the optimized zone. Never want to be flirting with the bottom of it, especially, again, being a female endurance athlete. I prefer to keep mine up towards the middle of that, like 60 range. So, as Ashley said, people are super surprised to find that they're deficient in it, but it's also one of the biomarkers that I really just kind of like because it's a pretty easy fix. It's challenging to get enough of it from your diet, so it's very much one of the few that, without hesitation, if I see someone's level where it is below that optimized zone, all right, let's start a supplement. Of course, you have to be a little bit more educated and cautious with the supplement. It's fat soluble. Toxicity is still not super common, but some people are just like, okay, I just want to throw the highest dose at that, and that's not the safest way to supplement. And that's, one of the things that I do like about InsideTracker is, if you say, all right, well, I'm already taking 2000 IU per day, and you get your blood tested and it's still on the low end, I'll automatically get that recommendation. Okay, time to increase it to 5,000 IU because 2,000 is not enough for you to meet, your needs. Might be enough for Ashley, not enough for Stevie. So that's another great tool there.
And it stresses the importance of retesting too, because you should not just take 5,000 IUs for the rest of your life, because you probably don't need it. So getting your blood work tested to tell you when it's a good time to drop it back, or maybe to hold off on it until you get into another season, is also really great feedback to get.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we talked about cortisol, we talked about testosterone and the ratio of cortisol and testosterone. We talked about ferritin. We talked about vitamin D. Any other markers that you feel like are critical that endurance athletes should be paying close attention to?
Those are probably the core ones for endurance athletes. Again, individualized. If you are a vegetarian, vegan, B12 is also going to be a helpful one to look at there. I find it also helpful looking at creatine kinase and two of the liver enzymes, ALT, AST. Those can all show us where muscle damage and muscle breakdown, if it's occurring, which of course, as we train, as Matt kind of touched on, we do want to see that muscle breakdown, that muscle damage. That's how we get stronger, faster, perform better. But if they sit high all the time, that shows us the body isn't recovering. Do you need to talk to your coach and look at your training schedule? It's another tool in the toolbox to help us also guide our rest, our recovery. Are we ready to go and get to the start line like Matt did at 100 Western States? Sorry.
And HSCRP is another one. We were chatting about it before we went live. Stevie has an amazing HSCRP story, but that's basically a marker of inflammation in your body. It's a non-specific marker. So it could be high because you have a toothache, maybe you have a nagging injury, like I could kick you in the shin. All of those things would make your HSCRP high. So having some context around maybe what your training is looking like, if you're doing a test, maybe during a peak training block or maybe on a down week and your inflammation is really high, that's a good indicator that maybe you need to take a little bit more rest, because a lot of endurance activities really put that strain on your joints, and your joints are going to show that they are stressed with inflammation, as your muscles are really going to show it in that creatine kinase.
Yeah,
Got
absolutely.
And DHEAS, we didn't really touch on too much, but for female athletes, that is the primary sex hormone that we test because it doesn't fluctuate based on your cycle. If you are under fueling, likely you'll see that DHEAS level lower. I think an important thing to remember just with all the sex hormones we test is that they aren't essential for you to live. So your body's not going to put resources into those things if you are making it use a lot of resources and activity, not to mention the responsibility of keeping your heart beating and your lungs breathing. So if you see big dips in that marker, that's another indicator that You need a little bit more food and probably a little bit more rest.
Mhm. Got it. So I wanna switch gears just a little bit. And Matt, I wanna ask you, we talked about your experience as an athlete, and I wanna ask you about your experience as a coach and why taking a look inside using blood analysis and a tool like InsideTracker when you're coaching an athlete, why is that so important to you? And what value does that bring into the equation when you're coaching someone?
Yeah, I think it boils down to one word, and that's consistency. To get better at anything, you need to be consistent. And one thing that the tests have done, and the benefit it's been for a lot of my athletes, they get them consistently, is that they're able to, if there is something going on, they're able to fix it right away. If we or just guess, if we don't get it done, it's a guessing game. What's going on with you? Why are you tired? Why do you keep getting injured? Blah, blah, blah. But if you keep getting tests done, whether it's 2 or 3 times a year, I like for my athletes that no more than, I don't think it's necessarily more than 3 times a year, but we're able to remain at a consistent level of training because we're not having these super highs and super lows with feeling good and feeling bad. We're able to just kind of stay steady and keep, we're keeping levels optimized, we're staying healthy. And when you're staying healthy, you're running good. And so I think that's the main reason. One thing, the pandemic was really interesting for me as a coach. I coach a lot of nurses, and one really cool thing for me was I was able to see the effect that COVID was having on these nurses. Not a cool thing, I guess it was a pretty big bummer. Actually, their training was just, out the window. A lot of these women and men were still trying to do what was in the training log, and they had a lot going on at work, obviously. And so I suggested most of them to get blood tests done to kind of see what biomarkers were off and what was really going on. And for every single one of them, cortisol through the roof, vitamin D super low, iron was really low. Obviously, probably weren't eating enough or eating right while they were working. And then creatine kinases levels were actually a lot higher too. And I think the reason was because, high stress at work, going home, putting in the training, sleeping for 2 or 3 hours, going back to work, working a 3-day shift, doing it all over again. They weren't recovering. So I think that, I was able to really take a look at a bigger subgroup like that and see a huge difference. And, since then I've started doing that with more subgroups within the athletes I coach, whether, it's people who live in a certain region, in Northeast where, it's going to be a little bit more cloudier or whatever, and can affect more things than just your mood. You're going to have lower vitamin D, that sort of thing. Athletes at altitude have got to stay on top of their iron and ferritin stores. And, you're not recovering as well at altitude. And so training is going to be affected a little bit differently that way too.
Got it. That's a pretty amazing story, and glad that you were able to identify that issue. That's pretty incredible. Now, I also want to touch on a topic that I know a lot of endurance athletes are curious about, which is, if you do make the decision to incorporate blood analysis into your training and your life, how often does it make sense to do something like this? And when does it make sense to get tested? And Stevie, I'd love it if you could kick us off on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, it's always fun and exciting to get your first InsideTracker results back, but it's a starting point. Of course, we can learn and, implement good interventions to help improve whatever biomarkers we might need to optimize based on what our goals are. But much like any sort of intervention, how do we know if eating more whole grains is helping our lipid panel if we don't get our cholesterol levels, if we don't do follow-up tests? So I base this on, kind of an individual basis, but if I can have someone testing, like Matt said, like 3 times a year, that would be awesome. Ideally, looking, endurance athlete wise, I hope all of you are taking an off season, taking some downtime. So at the start of your season, after your off season, which hopefully looks like a real off season with lots of rest and unstructured movement, get that baseline test so you can see, okay, where am I at after that time of rest, recovery, hopefully lots of good, nutrient dense foods, and say, get the green light. Okay, my body looks good. I can start base building. Or, that could be even an indicator. Okay, some of these levels don't look good. My inflammation is a little bit high, logically. And then we'd be like, okay, probably not a time to start, into a big, building of your training. So a baseline test, and then kind of as an individual is peaking for maybe their first race season, it also depends, individualized, based on, the distance you're racing, how often you're racing. But I like it as a good indicator of how is the body responding and recovering to training, after a couple good solid training blocks. And then if you're willing, it's also very interesting to see what can happen post-race. We know certain markers like HSCRP can stay elevated for up to 7 days after a race. Ashley referenced my HSCRP story. I did one year, I wanted to see what an Ironman did to my body. So I got tested 2 days after I did Ironman Louisville in October, and I had also raced Ironman Lake Placid in July. So it was that year I actually tested baseline 4 weeks out from Ironman Lake Placid, right after Ironman Lake Placid, and then another one before Louisville to see, okay, am I ready to go before, a second full Ironman season? And everything looked good. I actually PR'd Ironman Louisville. It was like a 35-minute PR on all disciplines, and then did the test afterwards. And my HSCRP jumped from right around 1 to 19, which if you're not familiar with InsideTracker, like the top of the optimized zone is like 0.6, 0.8-ish. So if you're willing to get a test 2 days after and see what happens to your body post-race, but if you're doing a lot of, like ultra marathons, very long distance, very hard racing throughout the year, kind of getting a test too after a couple big hard efforts, if you want to add one more race in to see, okay, how am I going to approach my training after this, Ironman Lake Placid, for example. I took actually a few weeks of rest and recovery, a little bit more than I probably would have, and then see, am I ready to toe the line before I go into this race and potentially hurt myself or do some long-term damage. So you can kind of map it out throughout what your season is. And that's also why InsideTracker Pro is great, because you and your coach can then look at your racing and training plan together. Right. A long-winded answer.
No, it's
for a short question.
No, I think the appropriate level of detail. It's a question that I think coaches and we get all the time. So I think it's good to shed light on it. And Matt, I know that you have a perspective on that as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure that the audience would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, very similar to Stevie's actually. I love the beginning of the year after you've had your kind of downtime. For a lot of my athletes, it tends to be around the holiday season. There's not a whole lot of trail racing or ultras going on during that time. So it's like, all right, let's take a break and before we get into this next phase. And so anytime December, January, I love my athletes to get a test done, get that baseline, kind of tell what's going on. And then for me, I really enjoy, like, after the first or second big block, just like Stevie said, getting one done, making sure nothing's changed too drastically. Obviously there's going to be a little bit, a few things are going to change in the biomarkers from when you were fully rested. That's okay. But it's the coach's job to be able to tell the athlete, okay, hey, look, this is a little bit lower. Let's incorporate this into training or into your diet. And let's, if we can train at a level where we can have your biomarkers like they were when you're fully rested, you're going to have an amazing race in the future. And, one cool thing for me is I coach a lot of ultra runners, and ultra running's kind of in this Wild West phase where it's still a pretty newish sport, similar to Ironman. Like, who knows what's going to happen to your body after you're done with it. The thing is there hasn't been a whole lot of research yet on the long-term effects of ultras. And so I've kind of taken it upon myself, and I know a few other coaches kind of done the same, where we like athletes to get tests done after their big A goal race. You know, if that, you know, even it can even be a week after. Sometimes I've seen, you know, I've gotten a lot of the data I want to from that. But yeah, I like to kind of see what was the damage, what was done, and then where it's really come in handy for me is athletes I've coached for 4 or 5 years now. I go back and look at their blood work they had done right after maybe the same peak race they did 4 or 5 years ago and now, and see the difference, you know, after we've incorporated everything from all their blood tests. And it's astonishing. Like, I mean, just with training alone, creatine kinases levels are a lot less, muscle breakdowns a lot less than it was before. And that's because we've implemented a lot of things like InsideTracker suggested. You know, we know now for certain athletes, it's really important to stay on top of vitamin D or iron, ferritin. And so, yeah, we've been able to manage that throughout the whole training process. And, you know, that's what's really cool. We're seeing 4 or 5 years later, hey, we're recovering from these hundreds way better than we were, you know, even, you know, when we first started. And it's going to be really cool to collect that data over the next 4 or 5 years and see, you know, if I'm fortunate enough to work with the same athlete for 8-10 years, it's going to be really cool to kind of see what's going on.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It really is. So we're getting to the top of the hour here, and we're pretty much out of time. I did want to ask one more question, Matt, really to you, which is if you have any parting words of wisdom that you want to share with the athletes and coaches that are watching or gonna watch.
Yeah, I think you know, I think it just goes to the importance of getting these blood tests done, getting an InsideTracker test done. You know, as an athlete, you spend money on a coach, you spend money on shoes, you spend money on these fancy watches and gadgets and all that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, you know, one of the most important things you can be spending the money on is a look at inside yourself and what's going on. If you're going to put in all this work and all this training to have these awesome goal races and that sort of thing, you really need to know what's going on to be able to optimize your performances and just well-being. I mean, I've gotten blood work done that has not only helped my athletic performance, but it's helped my well-being in general. And I think that that's really important. And, you know, obviously the less stressed you are, the happier you are, and the healthier you are, the better you're going to perform. And so, you know, I think that it's an important thing is just to get these tests done.
Couldn't agree more. And I'm sure Ashley and Stevie will second that in the work.
100%.
Yeah, with their clients and their athletes. Okay, well, we're gonna wrap up. So first of all, thank you everyone for attending, and a big thank you to you, Matt and Stevie and Ashley, for the educational and enlightening discussion today. I hope and we hope that everyone that watched today learned at least one thing, hopefully more, but that you can take with you to reach your endurance goals this year. So again, this was recorded. You will be receiving an email with a link to watch the full webinar shortly. And if you're interested in learning more about how InsideTracker can help you reach your goals this year, I encourage you to set a meeting with someone on our team. You're going to get a link in the email that we send you afterwards to set a meeting with our endurance lead to discuss your endurance goals this year and how InsideTracker can help you achieve them. And if you are a coach, dietitian, or you're an athlete who's working with a coach or dietitian, please check out InsideTracker Pro, insidetracker.com/pro, to learn how you can participate in the pro program and make InsideTracker a tool in your toolbox. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.